We're doing Brachos Daf Lamed Tes, top 10 teachings. The theme is going to be the Brisker idea of Chefsa versus Gavra, which I'll explain it as we get into it, but that means we're going to be talking about brachot. So we're going to be talking about is the construct of the blessing about you getting something, so it's more concerned about you, you're the person, the gavra, or is it what you're engaging with, the item, the food, that's the chefsa, that's the object. Obviously they're both happening, you are eating a piece of food, but the question is, in a halachic and also conceptual understanding, is the focus on the fact that you are getting something, some pleasure from eating, or it's what the object that you're eating in terms of the focus and the bracha. And we're gonna see this in a number of different areas in Berchos Hanenin today, all centered around Daf Lamed Ches, sometimes in the commentaries more, the Tosfos and the Rambam that surround this page or talk about the subject of this page. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a story where sometimes having a story about what a rabbi does 2,000 years later, 1,800 years later, we're learning the halacha from it. In this case, it's going to be a story about Rabbi Yochanan, who eats a olive without a pit. And at that time, it was a pickled olive. In the Torah, the Talmud says that something that's pickled is equivalent to it being cooked. And we're assuming, according to the way the story is told in the Talmud, that he makes a blessing afterwards, and that blessing is, in fact, the blessing that you make when you have a fruit, when you have the amount of fruit that you would be required to make a blessing on, which is in fact, according to many opinions, exactly an olive. The problem is he didn't have the pit of the olive; it was a pitted olive. So the question is, how does he make this blessing after he eats an olive without the pit? And the Yerushalmi has another version of the story that Tosas marks, which is that it seems that he did eat, perhaps he did eat. I'll take a look in a moment, see if he ate it with the pit or not. Actually, I think it's debated how to interpret that Yerushalmi. But the point is that he makes this bracha. And what about it's missing a little bit? So the Gemara says it's not that it has to be a whole olive, it has to be the size of a whole olive, but not necessarily the biggest olive, a medium-sized olive. So if this olive was a little bit bigger than a medium-sized olive, so then even though it was missing a pit, it had the prerequisite shear. And therefore you had to make a bracha on it. So that's number one. That's just the background to help us get a little bit deeper when we then turn to number two, which is the Tosfos. The Tosfos says that this whole conversation that the Gemara is having on the top of Lamed Tes Amud Aleph, which is kind of carrying over from 38b on the bottom, is in regards to the blessing that you would make after you eat a fruit. And there's a question there, how much fruit, what's the size of the fruit that you'd have to eat? And according to our reading of the Bavli, it's the size of an olive, a medium-sized olive. According to the Yerushalmi, I mentioned before, there's another reading that it could be that there's an opinion that the Bavli doesn't necessarily agree with, the Rambam doesn't bring it down, I believe the Rambam doesn't bring it down, but the Shulchan Aruch does, which is that if it's a whole fruit, even if it's not the shear, it's not the required amount, you still have to make a bracha achrona. The Shulchan Aruch brings that down as if it's a question mark, and therefore you shouldn't do it unless you're going to eat other foods that will bring it up to the shear. So that's the Shulchan Aruch on that. So if you're strict, you go by the Shulchan Aruch. If you're not strict, you can rely on the way many people read the Bavli, that it's cholek, that it argues on the Yerushalmi. That's fine. But what I wanted to talk to you here now is let's analyze for a moment conceptually, because this is how the Brisker derech works. Is you take this distinction. Tosfos has, it's a simple explanation, which is when it comes to eating something, there's the threshold of needing to make a blessing before is anything. Why? Versus a certain amount for making a blessing after. What's the difference? So the simple explanation would be the Talmud says that the rationale behind having to make a bracha rishona before you eat, a blessing before you eat, is based on the principle of whoever benefits from this world without thanking or blessing, acknowledging God, it's as if they are ma'ol b'kadshei shemayim. It's as if they're taking a sacred item and they're using it for their own personal use, which is forbidden. And in order to redeem it, so to speak, from its sacredness, to be able to eat it, you have to make the blessing. Okay, so any amount versus when you make an after blessing, the whole concept of an after blessing is, even if it's a non-biblical after blessing, there's a whole discussion of when there is and there isn't a biblical after blessing. We know that there is a biblical after blessing. V'achalta v'savata v'erachta. You shall eat and be satisfied. But in the very verse, it says be satisfied. And there's a question in the Talmud, is it v'achalta that you have to eat? Eat needs a shear, needs an amount. Or is it even more than just eating? Is it an amount of satisfaction? So there's basically three opinions about how much food is eating, or if it's even more, if it's being satisfied, that require the biblical Birchat HaMazon. But even what the rabbis are talking about, which could have a lower threshold, it doesn't have to be Kedei Sevilla necessarily, that you have to be totally satisfied, but it has to have Achila at least. It has to have a certain shear of Achila. And that's where the Brisker Torah comes in. This is the following. The blessing you make before you eat something it's on you. That's the gavra. That's the person. I wanna have a little bit of water. There's nothing in here, but I want to have a little bit of water. It's just a small sip. It's not a malei lugmav. It's not a revius. It's not the amount that I'd have to drink to make a after blessing, which is actually also a discussion here in the Tosfos. But it doesn't have the shear. I still have to make the blessing before because I am benefiting from drinking. It's not the drink that I'm looking at. It's the I. It's not the drink is the chefs, is the object. I am the gavra. I am the person, and therefore, since I want to have a sip, it's not about how big the shear, that it's a required amount for me to be obligated to make the bracha. So that's a simple explanation in this context, as opposed to when v'achalta v'savata, when I eat and satisfied or not, and overachta, and I bless, or a derivative of that, a rabbinic derivative of that, then it's about the object that I'm eating or drinking. So is there a shi'ur? Is there a halachic, specifically big enough amount to be considered food that's eaten or drink that's drunk? So it's on the object, not just on me, whether I've had some benefit on it. Okay, so that's number two. I mentioned there is a question about Borei Nefashos, and the question that Tosfos raises is Borei Nefashos modeled after the equivalent of the Al Hagafen, the after blessing you would make after drinking grape juice or wine, or is it in fact modeled after the Bracha Rishona? Meaning, is the Borei Nefashos, because the Tosfos already explained that the Borei Nefashos has two elements of it. One of it is that on whatever little enjoyment you have in life, even if it's unnecessary to be nourished with this enjoyment, I'm enjoying it. So in other words, with the Borei Nefashos is like the shahakol of the blessings, in the sense that it's very generic, it's not very specific, but it often just means it's like the icing on the cake. It sometimes could be something very nourishing as well, but often it's something which is just like, ice cream. It's questionable how much nutrients I'm getting out of eating the ice cream, but I really enjoy it. So perhaps the Borei Nefashos is similar. You can have, by the way, the best ice cream you could possibly have, the least fattening ice cream. I used to get this ice cream in Brooklyn. They would charge $1 for it. It was a baby ice cream. It was tiny. I'm sure it wasn't the sheer, and you enjoyed it, and it was so small you didn't feel guilty about having an ice cream. So according to Tosfos, you make a Borei Nefashos on it because it's not about the sheer. You didn't have to have a sheer. You had something. It's not how big the thing is. You as the subject, the gavra, the person, had something, so you had something, so you make a Borei Nefashos. Or perhaps you don't. Perhaps Borei Nefashos is modeled like everything else and needs a shear. That's a question, and it's raised by Tosfos and just back and forth in Tosfos. Number 3, also in Tosfos, this is a very important Tosfos. It's Tosfos Divrei Maskil Batzer LeShiur. It's the top of Lamed Testament Aleph. Number 3 is when you are about to eat something. It's brought down in the name of the Yerushalmi. You're eating some fruit, or some whatever it is, some fruit, some vegetable, and you're holding it, and you're a little clumsy or whatever it is. You make the bracha and then you drop it. So you would think that all you need to do is, okay, I have another. I'm not going to eat that fruit. It's soggy and it's on the floor. But I'll take it's a fruit bowl. I'll reach, I'll help myself to another serving, and I'll eat fruit. I made a blessing on the fruit. I didn't interrupt it other than just to take some new fruit. It takes, 10 seconds to put it on my plate or in my fork, whatever it is. No, you got to make a new blessing. And not only that, you should first say, Baruch Shem Kvod Malchuso. You should bless the name of the glory of God's kingship, L'olam Vad, forever, because you made a bracha that didn't take effect. The question is, what do you mean? You made a bracha. It's true you couldn't eat the food that you made the bracha on, it dropped, but the same type of food is there and you're replacing it. Well, the answer is exactly that. When you make a bracha, you are in a relationship to the object, even though we said before that making a bracha is about the gavra, making the bracha. Don't get too, meaning the individual, the person, not the object, but not exactly. It's the individual person is making a bracha on something specific, not on the generic thing. I make a bracha on fruit, and then surprise me. Let's see what you've got in the kitchen. I'm a guest, and I make a bracha, and I wait for the host to bring it out. No, the host brings it out. I take it on my plate, even in my fork or in my hand, whichever way I'm eating. I make the bracha on what I'm going to actually eat, not on what's in the kitchen, not on what's in the bowl, in the serving center of the table, but what's on my plate, or even really, preferably, what's in my hand. So which is very beautiful in the sense that your blessing is very specific. It's not just like, God, I thank you for the food, but it's thank you for the food, specifically this particular food that I'm going to eat. So once you drop the food and you're going to get new food, you have to make another bracha. Rabbi Soloveitchik points out, I think in the name of one of the other earlier, maybe Reb Chaim, the Brisker of Brisk, that there's a similar concept in Birchas HaTorah when you make a blessing on the Torah, and the guy, the Baal Koreh, says, "Oh, we took out a Torah. This is not the right portion. We got to find it." He starts rolling it it's in a whole nother sefer. And 5 minutes later, he finds it and he says, "Okay, we're here." According to, you have to make another bracha. Question is, why do you have to make another bracha? You made a Birchas HaTorah. Like, in theory, you can lane another parsha even on the wrong parsha because it's still Torah. I mean, everybody thinks, no, you can't. You have to read only this week's parsha, and that's the custom. But that's exactly it. It's a custom. In fact, today there are certain shuls that are reading 2 parshios every single Shabbos. The first aliyah, they'll read a whole parsha that they skipped due to COVID. And then the rest, the other 6 aliyahs and the maftir, they'll read the current parsha. Why? Because Torah is Torah, and you could read any parsha in the Torah theoretically on any Shabbos. It's just that our custom is not to do that. Our custom is to try to, but in theory, what difference does it make? Why should the person have to make a new bracha? And the answer is, according to Rabbi Soloveitchik, that there is a connection between Birchas HaNenen and Birchas HaTorah, a relationship between these two things. And just like when you make a bracha on this fruit, you're in a relationship with the fruit, my friend. You see a fruit and you make a blessing on it, it's going to become who you are. You're attracted to the fruit. And some New Age people would say the fruit's even attracted to you if you're fruity enough. So how much more so if you have to make a specific bracha on the fruit you're going to eat, and the new one, if your fruit dropped and you have to take a new fruit, how much more so when you make a bracha on the Torah? You're making a bracha not just on the generic Kol Torah Kula, but you're making a bracha on the appropriate Torah for you. God, give me my portion of the Torah. And here I am, getting an aliyah for this week. I want to read the right parsha. I don't want to read the wrong parsha. I don't want it to be like... So that's a connection. So that's a little bit about number 3. One other thing about number 3 that Tosas raises a question, which is, what about if water is flowing? We know that you make a shahakol, even though by the time you don't have it, you're just like kind of scooping it up like that and drinking it. Although I don't know if that's the safest thing. You probably should be careful where you're drinking from. But assuming it's known it's a safe, fresh water, but it's flowing, by the time you actually get the water in your mouth, the water that you originally made the bracha on is already 5, 10, 20, 30 feet away from you because it's flowing. So how does that work? And Tosa says, well, that's easy. You know the water is flowing. So mentally, when you make the bracha, you kind of know that it's not going to be the exact same water, and that's okay. Now let's take a look at this because the Rambam is very similar to Tosfos, and let's see what Rabbi Soloveitchik has a couple points here in Rishimas Harav, in Rishimas Shiurim, and he says the following point. So the Rambam says that you don't make a bracha on something not in front of you. If in fact you made a bracha for something that was still in the kitchen while you're in the dining room, and then they bring it out, you got to make another bracha when you eat it. So that implies that there is this concept, at least partially, even though we said before that Birchas HaNenen, there's usually the bracha rishona, the first blessing, is more about the gavra, but not completely. it's not just about you. I want to eat an apple. It's not about which apple. I want to eat an apple. I make a bar eitz, and then the apple will come. No. I want to eat this apple, so I make a bar eitz on this apple. If the apple isn't there, and I make a bar eitz, and then they bring it to me, I got to make it again once they bring it. So when it comes to the water, we said that that's different. So it could be that the Rambam holds that water is considered one flow of water. It's mechubarim. It's considered like a unit, a connected unit. And he brings something like this about the Daled Minim. If you don't have the four species of the lulav all tied together, you could be yotze if you do it one at a time, as long as they're all four in front of you. So it could be that Tosas could say that it's your mind that connects you to what isn't really in front of you while you're making the bracha. But the Rambam says it's considered as if it's in front of you. And I just wanted to a lot of people know, for example, there's a big question right now halachically about the status of a Zoom minyan, or a Zoom Kriyas HaTorah, or a Zoom Kedusha, responding to the Kaddish or Kedusha or Baruch Hu on Zoom. And many people have pointed out that, well, it's really being recorded and replayed, even a phone. Well, halachically, it may be more like the flowing water. That even though we know that it's not exactly the same as being there in person, just like we know that it's a flow. So halachically, I'd like to argue that there's certain times that a Zoom minyan would be effectuated by the fact that it appears to be as if it's happening live. Even if it's delayed by half a second, even if it's recorded and resound, it's like the water. The fact that it's something real, you see it, it appears to be real. Now, does that mean that everything we now do on Zoom, whether it's shofar blowing, the shofar has its own category, why it's problematic? Or now you could see somebody eating the matzah. No, you didn't eat the matzah. There's certain things, perhaps listening to a chazan, maybe for the actual minyan, you should have an actual physical group in one place, having a minyan, but to be mishtatef, to be a contributor and to be a listener who responds with an amen or even a baruch Hu, I believe that this is one of the proofs of this concept. It has to be a little more than that, so I'm not relying on this heavily. I'm just saying I'm also relying on the fact that the Rebbe davened for 11 months for his Rebbitzin when she passed away, and many Chabad Hasidim said Kaddish, Kedusha, Baruch Hu on these live hookups. Okay, and other stories like that. That's number 3. Number 4, a little bit about the Bracha Levatala, which is also brought down in this context by this Tosfos, and I just wanted to point out, we mentioned what do you do when you say a bracha and realize that the bracha wasn't effective. You say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam Va'ed, and there's a whole discussion of like what does that do, because what it is we said, the Gemara said earlier that whoever says a bracha levatala, it's as if they violated the prohibition of not taking God's name in vain. Now, Rabbeinu Tam, there's right off the bat, Tosfos, Rabbeinu Tam says that that's not literally what it means, but it seems like the Rambam, at least according to some readings of it, seems to take it as if you actually are violating, taking God's name in vain by saying a bracha levatala, which seems a little harsh, but that's the way it is. And until today, the Sephardic poskim, particularly Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, are very strict about the Isur a bracha levatala because they probably follow the Rambam. That would make sense. So that's number 4. And by saying Baruch Shem, you mitigate the kind of use of God's name, because what you're doing is you're glorifying God's name. So you're saying, God forbid that I actually said God's name for no reason, even though you had a reason when you said it. It didn't actually connect to ma'aseh, to action, because you dropped the food in the case of you're going to eat something and then you drop the food. So one other thing about this concept of not taking God's name in vain. I'm having a senior moment. I don't remember what I was going to say, but okay, let's continue then. Crazy story here in the Gemara, where there are 2 students. The Gemara is still kind of tying up some loose ends in the debate about whether cooked vegetables you make the bracha of, or soup for that matter, vegetable soup, or vegetables that got overcooked, which is probably what the word shlakot means. It means cooked vegetables or slightly overcooked vegetables. Whether you make the bracha of ha'adama or shahakol. Now, fruit juice, we know, with the exception of grape juice, wine, and olive oil, which in theory, it's really just great. For practical purposes, just wine and grape juice. All other liquids, we make a shahakol, fruit juices. We don't make the ha'etz on apple juice and orange juice, on watermelon juice, and so on and so forth. But there is a debate about cooked vegetables, and the halacha, in fact, is that we make a hadama, with very few exceptions. Perhaps if you took something that should not have been cooked, like if you took lettuce and you cooked the lettuce, maybe that would be an exception, something like that. Okay, but with very few exceptions, the halacha is cooked vegetables are ha'adama, but it's still being somewhat debated. And the Gemara says, Le'me Tanai. Let's say it's like a debate amongst the Tanaim, which is itself a problem because they quote the story of Bar Kafra, who himself was a student of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So to say that he's a Tana and that his students are Tanaim, because two of his students had a disagreement, is itself questionable, and the commentaries point this out. But the thing is like this: they're invited to. They're invited to a meal with him. And the question is, what part of the meal is it? Rashi says it was like an appetizer course that for somehow wasn't... Rashi, I think, learns that for hamotzi to cover the other parts of the meal, the hamotzi has to be an active part, like you're using the bread as dipping it into the hummus and the tchina and the baba ganoush and the whatever gravy, as long as you're eating bread with it, then you make hamotzi. According to Rashi, it's not that they didn't wash, but this wasn't the part of the meal that you have bread with. According to Tosfos, there was no bread at this meal. And Tosfos that creates its own conundrums for Tosfos, which we're not going to get into. It's a problematic Tosfos. But what's on the menu for this meal? So there's chicken pullet or partridge or duck, something really something worth dying for. God forbid, but you'll hear the story. Something really, really good. And then there's these vegetables, like cabbage and other vegetables that we're not really sure what they are, but they're like vegetables. It's pretty clear from the story that it's not like sometimes you get chicken and some fried onions, or steak and some French fries. It's pretty clear from the story here that the vegetables were significant, meaning they were either filling, or they weren't just tiny little side dish. They had value in and of themselves. Perhaps even more value than the chicken. Rabbi Bar Kapara asked one of his students to lead them in making a blessing for the food. Now the question is, what is he going to make a blessing on? Is he going to make a blessing on the chicken, the duck, or is he going to make a blessing on the vegetables? And he quickly made a blessing. He didn't ask his Rebbe. He makes a blessing on the chicken, and then the other student starts humiliating him and saying, "What are you? You love duck so much that you couldn't make a blessing on the vegetables? Like you're obviously starving for a little bit of meat, or in this case chicken, or whatever it is." And Bar Kapar gets very upset, and he yells. And he says, "I'm not yelling at the person who made the bracha. I'm yelling at the one who insulted him and embarrassed him, that accused him of being a chicken lover." Let's see the language of the Gemara. If it looks like your friend never had meat in his life, meaning he's so excited, it's like his first time, does that make it right for you to embarrass him? And then he proceeds to say, now I'm not yelling on the one who insulted his friend. I'm yelling at the person who made the blessing. I'm upset at him. If there's no wisdom here, at least isn't there seniority here? Am I not an elder? Meaning, you consider yourself as smart as me, fine. But I've been around longer, so if you're not sure what to make a blessing on, I'm right here, I'm your rabbi, shouldn't you be asking me? Gemara says it was a bad ending. So the Gemara wants to analyze that story and say that perhaps the debate between these two students of Bar Kapara is as follows. The one who made the bracha held that everything is shahakol. Cooked vegetables are shahakol, and the chicken or duck are shahakol. And therefore he made the bracha on what he felt was better, which is the chicken. He liked it better. The guy who made fun of his friend thought that no, the cooked vegetables are bori priyadama, the chicken, the fowl is shahakol, and it's more important to make a bori priyadama first. And that was their debate. And the Gemara rejects that interpretation and says that it's not necessarily, it could have been something else that they were arguing about. It didn't have to be about the bori priyadama versus the hot shahakol, about the cooked vegetables. But so the commentaries discuss what the halacha is. The halacha, according to many Rishonim, is that you generally go, you make the bracha for, there's a hierarchy of what's more valuable in the brachot, and we'll learn more about that in number 6. But basically, a hadama should come before a shahakol. The Meiri, and probably his preceding him, the Rambam, because the Rambam doesn't make this distinction that the other Rishonim make, hold that you make a bracha on whatever you want first. Meaning, if you're at a meal and there's a little bit of chicken, there's a little bit of steak, there's a little bit of there's little like plates of different things in a meal. So it's not like one is subservient to the other. It's not like the onions on the steak, but it's like separate little things. Like you're at a smorgasbord and you filled up and you took all these different things and you bring them back to your table. So according to the Meiri, what's your favorite thing? If the duck is your favorite thing, go ahead and make the bracha on the duck, even though there's some other thing there that's Hadama. The Rov Rishonim, and the majority of the Rishonim hold that no, you make the Hadama first. So the questions asked is, why doesn't the Meiri follow the implications of this Gemara, which Tosfos and others do? And the answer is, that's given, is that you don't learn from a story where there was insults and then anger, because perhaps Bar Kapar got upset at the way the students were interacting with one another, so it stopped being an actual limud of what the halacha is, but more just him dealing with students who were disrespectful, both to each other and to him. And it's not, we don't learn the halacha from it because there was anger. And even though we know that sometimes a parent or a teacher can pretend to be angry to teach a valuable lesson to their children, it seems like this anger, I don't want to say it was unwarranted, but it seems like one of the main themes of Gemara in terms of is kavod, is honor and respect, and in that sense, when a teacher feels they're being disrespected, the consequences are pretty severe sometimes, and sometimes it's a mistake. Sometimes unfortunately a person thinks that they're being slighted, but the slight isn't intentional, and it's not nearly as severe as you would think it is. So that being the case, we don't necessarily learn the halacha from the story, according to at least the Meiri. Again, many other people do learn the halacha from the story, so it really depends. Okay, so we're going to continue. A second here. Okay. There we go. That's terrible. Okay. There we go. Okay. So that was number 5. Unfortunately, we see till today people fight over things. Sometimes it doesn't matter how big or small the thing that people fight over. Once you have a fight, you're in a fight, and it's the consequences could be very severe. I just witnessed 2 people fighting over a mask. Somebody came into not my shul, but some other outdoor prayer space, and he was wearing a shield, but he wasn't wearing a mask, and right away somebody else kind of yelled at him, and then it just, it quickly got heated, and people, both parties involved, feelings were hurt, and what I've seen is that often, not always, that when there are people who get upset about being asked to wear the mask, not because they won't wear the mask or don't believe in wearing the mask, which there's plenty of that also, but often it's simply that they feel that they're being accosted by people who are not first welcoming them and accepting them and then asking them to put on the mask. And also I've seen here on the west side, there's both part, that most people are just normal, like they live and let live, they wear the mask. But there's other people that are really crazy, and both who refuse to wear the masks and also who go out of their way to terrorize people who, for innocent reasons, are outdoors and just, not in anyone's 6 feet, and they're just like yelling at people and obnoxious, jerky people. So the main point here is that you can make a fight over anything, and it's important that we don't do that. It's very easy to fight, even over a bracha. It's not worth it. Okay, that's number 5. Number 6 is what we were talking about in when you make the hadama before the shahakol, which is most authorities say to do that. So yeah, we've already kind of been talking about number 6 a little bit. But there's also Rashi and Tosfos, which is Rashi says it's more chashuv. The hadama in that story is considered of more importance. I was thinking about this. We have the 9 days coming up. We go for meat without a week. Big deal. We can't even do that. We have to have a siyum. I'm going to make a siyum or two. So those who want to eat meat, can eat some meat. But perhaps it's telling us that there's something more chashuv about things that grow from the ground, that we don't have to hurt anything. That's perhaps one way of learning Rashi. Tosfos says it's not so much about the item itself, it's about the bracha. The bracha is muvureres. It's more specific and has a greater level of clarity that you give to it. There's a brisker chakira, which would be if it's about, is it Gavra versus Chafsa? Again, the same concept that a shahakal is not about the Chafsa, is not about the object, it's just about the Gavra, the person. I'm going to eat something, so I make a shahakal. So it's very generic, very open-ended. But a hadama is about giving a hakara, a recognition of the specific type of food. It's hadama. What about ha'etz? Is ha'etz like? Is ha'etz even more mevurar? Is it more specific and clear, maybe even than a hadama? So that's a brisker hakira. Number 7 is there's a discussion in the Talmud about how to cut your challah, your bread. There's actually 3 opinions. We'll focus on the last. The last 2 opinions are either you make the bracha and you cut it as you're making the bracha. So by the time you complete the bracha, you finish the first cut right before you make the bracha, or complete the bracha, I should say. So by the time the bracha is completed, it's already cut. And the other opinion is, why do that? Just make the bracha and then cut it. Tosfos, okay, so that's number 7. Number 8 is Tosfos on that. Tosfos actually goes ahead and says that even though the halacha is that you first make the bracha and then cut it, and that's in fact what we do on Shabbos, but the rest of the week we should begin to cut it, or cut it halfway, not all the way, or not too much of the way so it doesn't fall apart yet. And the reason why he says that is we don't want to make a hesach hadas. We don't want to make too much of an interruption. There's a question of what hesach hadas? That's what you're doing to eat. It's not such a strong Tosfos, but it is a Tosfos. Not everyone agrees with that Tosfos. And then the Gemara has in number 9. There's a whole discussion in the Gemara. Huna says that if you have pesisin b'shleimin, if you have pieces, and the way some of the commentaries say is a big piece versus a whole loaf, but the big piece, that's a cut-up piece, is bigger than the whole loaf. According to, I believe it is Reb Huna, you make the bracha on, you could make the bracha on, or you should make the bracha on the piece rather than the whole loaf. And the other opinion is no, you make the bracha on the whole loaf. And the Meshilot says, what's the debate about? There's other, before I get to the Meshilot, there's other commentaries that say it's basically a bracha. The question is, are brachos have any element of common sense in them, or are brachos based on their own model? So, for example, common sense is that you eat a piece that was already broken, a loaf that was already cut. You finish what was already started before you start a new thing, right? If I have 2 things of cheese in my cheese, whatever it is in the fridge. One is half eaten, and the other one is still hasn't been touched. I'm going to finish the one that's half eaten before I start the new one. So logically, let the person finish the pieces before they begin the new loaf. So that's one. Some of the commentators one like that. Versus no, the bracha is something that's special. So you want to make it on what's most significant, and what's most significant and special is the whole loaf, because if it looks better, it is better in that sense. There's even another shita that says it's more like bread that's cut up is softer than the first cut of bread, but I don't know if that's really true. Not necessarily, unless you just like to eat the inside of a piece of bread, but that's not what we're talking about. So the Meshloach says that it's about once you've already eaten some of that bread, presumably you've already sanctified it, you've already made a bracha on it from an earlier time, and the Meshloach connects that to something later in the daf, and the top of daf mem, I believe it goes over, which is this idea of eating the thing that you initially used for an eruv, let's say an eruv tavshilin. So the next day you eat it because you already did one mitzvah with it. So once you did one mitzvah with it, do another mitzvah with it. So that's how the Meshloach understands this concept. Is like you already did one mitzvah, you already made a bracha on it before, and continue to do it. We find this also in Derech Eretz, which means like how we treat vendors and hotels even. So for example, the Medrash which Rashi quotes by Abraham, when Abraham would travel, it says he would always go back to the hotels that had put him up in an earlier trip. And you could ask, it's always great to find a new hotel. Why not? I heard they have a good spa on this one, and a nice bar in the other one. Why not just keep looking for new and better? Why is Avram going to the same? Because if they treated you right and they did good by you, why not build on that? I think it's very important today because so many things have been upended because of the coronavirus. We can say everything we do is totally new. It has nothing to do with the past. We just make a clear break from whatever was, and we create a new reality, a virtual reality. And the Gemara is saying, no, you make, according to Rav Huna, you make a bracha on the psisin, on the pieces rather than the shlemos, because you already have as silly as it sounds, you have a relationship with the older pieces of bread because you've already eaten them. So that could be a little bit about the psychology of that debate according to the Meshloach. And number 10, final thought is the Gemara records that there was a guy whose name was something like Shalom, a derivative of Shalom, peace. And he used to make both sides happy. What he would do is he would take the piece and put it together with a whole challah, and he'd make the bracha on the two together. Again, this is during the week. The Gemara points out that on Shabbos we should have Lechem Mishnah. But the Gemara says, HaKol Modim B'Pesach, everybody agrees that on Pesach, we put the prusa b'soch hashlema. We combine the broken piece of matzah with the whole piece of matzah, and we make the hamotzi. And on that, there's a debate between the Rambam on the one side and many of the other Rishonim on the other about whether or not you actually have 3 matzahs, which is the custom that most people have, or just 2. And perhaps you don't need Lechem Mishnah. You should just have 1 full matzah, and then the other matzah that you recited the Haggadah on, the half a matzah, which is lechem oni, because the Gemara says you need lechem oni, you need to have a broken piece of bread. Rabbi Soloveitchik points out that if you have only 1.5 matzahs, so then you don't have lechem mishnah. So why even bother with 1 whole one? And he brings out that the Rambam says that really all the time when you make hamotzi, he paskins like the opinion that says you should make it on a shalem, on a shlemus. You should make hamotzi even during the week on a full piece of bread. How much more so on Yom Tov you should make lechem mishnah, but on Pesach you don't need lechem mishnah because you have lechem oni, you have a broken piece. But at least you should also have 1 lechem shalem, just like we would have during the week. That's an interesting thought, because a lot of people think Shabbos we sanctify the challah, we have 2 challahs. According to the Vilna Gaon, by the way, you have to make a motzi on 2 challahs, both challahs, meaning you have to start both challahs every meal, not just one of the 2. So it's an interesting concept that that's overridden by the need to have lechem oni, meaning lechem oni supersedes. It's not in addition to lechem mishnah according to the Rambam that you also have to have lechem oni. It is you don't need lechem mishnah because the idea is that you have to have a broken challah. Anyway, thank you for watching.